Welcome back to Viewpoint. Stay with us. The panel tonight is Janet Olbrichson and Jonathan Swan. It'd be great to get their readout on the week that's just been. But for now, we're crossing to Melbourne, where we're joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Alan Tudge. Thanks for joining us, Alan.
G'day, Chris.
Look, Alan, you've got primary responsibility for Indigenous issues, helping the Prime Minister out with Indigenous issues, which is an area we all know he's keen to focus his government on. I want to talk to you about employment. You're focusing on Indigenous employment. We all hear about how we need to improve Indigenous education and Indigenous health, but in employment terms, but governments for many years, many decades, Liberal and Labor, have failed to help Indigenous people get into the workforce.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've got two sharp focuses, if you like, Chris. One is to get kids to school, because fundamentally, if they're not at school, they won't be learning. And secondly, we want to get the adults into work, ideally into real jobs, but if not into real jobs, into at least some activity so that they're learning work skills.
The statistics here are quite troubling. I see in a speech you gave recently that less than half of Aborigines of working age are actually in employment. When it comes to younger Indigenous Australians, only 20% or just less than 20% are either studying or working. Now, this is a massive problem because it must add to other issues in terms of if people aren't working, that they of course can't look after their own housing, their own health needs, the education of their children and the like.
Yep, you're absolutely spot on, Chris. That's why we're focusing so critically on this area, because if you've got a reasonable education and you've got a job, then everything else tends to take care of itself. And as you pointed out, at the moment there's more people who are living on welfare than there are actually people who are living on a job. And we want to change that equation. And perhaps even more depressing, Chris, is that the gap between the Indigenous employment rate and the non-Indigenous employment rate has actually increased over the last 4 or 5 years rather than decreased. And when you combine that with the demographics of the Indigenous population, where half the population's under the age of 20, then we've got a real issue on our hands. And if we don't change the trajectory soon, then we're going to have mighty problems in 5, 10, 15 years' time.
Now, I want to get some more of your insights into the causes and possible solutions to this in a moment. But before we do that, I want to share with our viewers a bit of your backstory, if you like, because I think it's important that people know about your passion for this. Now, full disclosure, you and I worked together 7 or 8 years ago in the Howard government for Foreign Minister Alexander Downer. Now, you're a bloke, though, who'd worked, highly educated. You've graduated even from Harvard. You've been working for Boston Consulting and the like. You could have gone off and made your fortune. You chose instead to go to Cape York and work with Noel Pearson at the Cape York Institute and absolutely embed yourself in this challenge of Indigenous disadvantage. What drove you to do that, and is this now your life's mission?
On the first question, it was an opportunity which presented itself to me, and I thought that I could assist with Noel Pearson's agenda. He was just transferring from his land rights agenda through to his economic responsibility and personal responsibility agenda, and I thought I had something to offer him at that stage, and worked with him for a few years, and also helped establish a corporate secondment program which has since sent hundreds of people into remote Indigenous Australia. So is it part of my life work? I'd like to think that I'll be engaged in this space for many, many years to come. I think it's incredibly important for the nation, for all of us to be engaged in some capacity, all of us to be thinking about it, and certainly while I'm part of the government, I'll be trying to keep it high on the political agenda so that we can be focused on it and thinking about it and hopefully moving forward with it.
Well, with that incredible experience you've had at Cape York on the ground and your experience in government as a staffer and now as a parliamentary secretary, what do you believe are the causes? Why is it that so many Indigenous Australians are out of work? I mean, obviously in remote communities, one of the big problems is there just aren't the jobs available.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's different issues in the urban and regional areas versus in the remote. And in the remote areas, as you say, Chris, there simply aren't that many jobs available. combine that with catastrophic education levels because kids aren't going to school, the schools themselves haven't been delivering, so it makes it exceptionally difficult. In the urban areas, the situation is better. There's many people who are working, they own their own home, they're getting on with life just like everybody else, but unfortunately there's still too many people who don't have work. Now, some of the issues. I think that obviously the education levels is very important. Those who have got a good education tend to be okay. But the welfare system itself, I think, is still a disincentive in many places for people taking up work. And I think that we often need, I think, some additional assistance for people who want to be mobile, so that if there isn't a job where they're located, then perhaps there could be an opportunity to assist them if they did want to move to another location, even for a short time, to get work.
You've got a bill. You've got a bill before Parliament at the moment. It will go through. It gives people a bonus, a cash bonus if they stay in a job a year, a bigger cash bonus if they stay in 2 years, and importantly, provides up to $6,000, I think, for people to shift, move to another location to take a job. Now, this is a scheme that's going to be open, of course, to all Australians of whatever race or background. But I think you believe this is going to especially be helpful for Indigenous Australians?
Well, I think it will be for those people who have got some reasonable skills and want to work. And at the moment, there's not many incentives for them to maybe leave their community presently and to get a job somewhere else, particularly when you add up the different finances. If they look at what they're getting at the moment, sometimes when you add up your dole payments and your family tax benefits and compare that to what you might get on an entry-level job somewhere else, the differences are actually not that great. So this scheme will provide a small cash incentive to support people to move if they want to, and additionally, if they're going from unemployment into a job, there will be a cash bonus at the end of year 1 for sticking it out, and a further cash bonus at the end of year 2 if they further stick that out again. So we think that will be of assistance, but it won't be the only thing that we're doing, but it will be an important measure.
We're starting to hear from Tony Abbott that it's going to be a tough budget. You're talking about a program there that's going to cost more money. Are you going to have extra money to try and deliver on your aims in Indigenous advancement? And secondly, what you've said there about social welfare, are you looking at cutting welfare in order to provide greater incentives to go to work?
We're not looking at cutting welfare, but what we are looking at, for example, in relation to welfare is ensuring that if people are on welfare, then they are at least contributing through a work for the dole type of system. And that means when they're weighing up a job versus staying on the dole, then it's tilted more in favour of work rather than staying on welfare. So they're the types of things that we might be looking at, in addition to obviously the mobility packages that we talked about before. Overall, the budget is going to be very, very tough, Chris. As you know, we inherited a financial mess. The projections are for $123 billion of deficits over the next 4 years.
We'll hear that economic argument a bit later in the program, but just back on Indigenous issues, is discrimination a reason that we're seeing so few, we have problems getting enough Indigenous people into employment? Are they discriminated against in the workplace?
I don't know, Chris, the answer to that. Some people will tell me that sometimes they do face discrimination. On the other hand, the Australian Employment Covenants, which Twiggy Forrest started, has now got commitments for something like 50,000 jobs for Indigenous people. They're commitments from some of our biggest companies in Australia. In some regards, I think there's actually tremendous goodwill across corporate Australia to employ more Indigenous people, and what we need to do is harness that goodwill and into real action to connect people from where they are into those jobs and support them to stay there. Because once they're in that job for 6 months, a year, 2 years, then the chances are they'll be away and they'll be thriving.
Well, one of the reasons I ask that, of course, is because your government has got the amendments forward at the moment to the Racial Discrimination Act. Do you support that winding back, if you like, the lowering of the threshold on racial vilification?
The question here that we've got to answer, Chris, is how do we deal with racism? Racism is unacceptable in Australia in any form and at any time. But the question is, what forms of speech should be outlawed? Should we be asking the police to intervene and the courts to intervene? Versus what types of speech is still egregious, still unacceptable, but is better left to directly addressing the person who's making such offensive remarks.
That is indeed the question. Where do you stand? Are they are the laws too draconian at the moment?
I think the balance is wrong at the moment because it includes words like offend and insult in the definition of what is a crime. Now, sometimes you can say, as just heard on that clip beforehand, it's talking about someone's Irishness. Now, technically that could be included under the definition of the present act because it doesn't even have to be race related. It can be nationality related. Now, if someone's just offended by that comment because of reference to your Irishness, now I don't think we should be calling in the police in that instance. So the balance is wrong. I think we've got a better balance with the current Act, which still has some protections, particularly in relation to inciting hatred, in relation to vilifying, and in relation to intimidating. And I think just the onus is slightly higher from where it is today.
Well, I mean, I happen to agree with you on that point. I think the changes are worthwhile. Why are we starting to hear so much dissent from within the Liberal Party with people backgrounding against George Brandis's bill? Why couldn't a Liberal Party unite behind this push to increase freedom of speech?
Well, I think there is a general agreement that the Section 18C provisions as they stand now need to be amended for some of the reasons which I articulated. The question is where we move to, and there should quite rightly be vigorous debate about where the proper line is drawn. And yes, it should be drawn differently, but where? Now, we've put some draft proposals on the table. We're asking for public comment and public consideration, and then following that consultation period, then the final proposals will be put to the Parliament for further debate.
All right, now as we've seen in this interview, there are plenty of serious issues that your government is tackling and that we can all discuss. Are you disappointed that your Prime Minister distracted the nation with his personal indulgence on sirs and dames this week?
I think Sir Chris Kenny's got quite a nice ring about it, Chris. And
yeah, no, I've already declared I'd have to abstain.
I think people have made a bit too much out of it. In some respects, one of the weaknesses of the existing Australia Day awards, particularly the very most senior ones, is that people often don't realise who has one and who doesn't. And the award of a title of Sir and Dame sticks with that person, and forevermore when they're introduced, you know that that person has made an incredible contribution to our nation, above and beyond what could ordinarily be expected from anyone. So I think it had some value in that regard. But you know, it's the Prime Minister's call on this, but I'm happy to go along with it.
Indeed it was. Indeed it was, and you probably have no choice. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, Alan Tudge. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Chris.
That's Alan Tudge, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, as you heard, working feverishly to try and improve the levels of Indigenous employment in this country. After the break,